This is the AI Advantage podcast, where we explore how AI is shaping professional services. Most AI conversations are with people excited about what it might do. Bjorn spent 3 decades building systems that actually had to work at places like IBM, Wells Fargo, Truist, where a bad model output isn't a demo failure, it is a regulatory event. He runs Kinetic Cognition. This conversation is all about real deployment. Welcome, Bjorn.
Thanks for having me.
Let's jump right into it. 30 years of AI deployment experience. Maybe you can start there. What all have you deployed, and what's different between what you saw before and what you're seeing in the latest wave?
Sure. And just for clarity, I've focused really since 2015 when I joined IBM Watson, really almost exclusively on AI. And previously to that, I implemented systems that would now be called AI, but back then were called things like machine translation, for example, in the 90s, or speech recognition systems in the early 2000s in a startup in Silicon Valley. But a lot of lessons are quite portable from those experiences where, as an example, in 1995, we implemented a machine translation system in Los Angeles in a then fairly small translation and localization agency. And the machine was able to translate many more words than a human translator could, but with different quality criteria. And by today's standards, a very simple technology. And one of the questions that came up was, what do we call the output? Because normally you would go from translate to edit to proof. And the machine would now produce, instead of 2,000 words, 100,000 words a day. But we weren't quite sure how to position the output. So in the workflow, how do we integrate that new AI/machine translation system into the workflow? How do we deal with the output? Do we need to further refine it, or how do we refine it? And then translators and editors, rightly so, asked, was this thing going to replace me? And so many of these motifs are now coming up very much the same way again. One of the other profound impacts that this was going to have is the business model. Because if you charge by the word, which human translators do, how do you then pivot to some kind of other accounting, or do you try to capture the 50x speed up entirely from this system? So quite a few lessons then also going on into the early 2000s, building these speech automation systems. Instead of pressing buttons, when you call a big company like American Airlines or TiVo, you would get a voice menu. And instead of saying for press or say one for billing or tech support, it would just say, tell me how I can help you. So this was open-ended speech technology, and it worked reasonably well. We used it to do everything from airline bookings to support for TiVo and so on and so forth. And unsurprisingly, the way you phrased the dialogue, the prompt to the user, to the caller, would greatly determine the success rates of each dialogue state and the system overall. So we did hire back then, many years ago, over 20 years ago, hired prompt engineers and dialogue designers. And again, that's, of course, a very valuable skill now, to tell the machine how to prompt or refine prompts iteratively with the help of a large language model, and knowing what to do, because the how the machine can really handle quite well. But what to know that you need to create a good system prompt, or to refine the role and the output and the strictures and the limitations and things like that. So overall, I'd say many and portable lessons there, even though the technology has, of course, greatly evolved.
Yeah. I still remember many times in early days when there was voice recognition, it would not recognize my thick accent. And so I would struggle with it. And over time, it gotten better. But I could see now why they were trained in a certain way, certain tone, certain voice, and doesn't recognize some of the variations of words and sounds, right? Because it all has to be trained by people.
Then critically, how do you, if it fails, what do you do? Do you reprompt? How do you say that I didn't understand you as a system, right? And this goes back to then, there are very advanced studies on how to design voice user interfaces. And I chuckle sometimes when I heard people a couple of years ago saying, "Oh, we've invented a whole new profession called prompt engineer or dialogue designer." And I was like, I hired those people in 2004, so it's not all that new.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Can you bring it back to IBM and then especially the newer wave, which 2015 is not long time ago, but we think it's almost like as if it is like in Stone Ages. But there is what you guys were working on was groundbreaking at the time for that age.
Mhm.
Maybe you can bring to what you were working on there and then actually bring it to where we are now. And though I think at least if you could help our listeners contrast between what is common, there's a lot of things that seem the same, but there are one or two things that are different. What are the things that are different?
Yeah, and I was in the right place at the right time. I joined IBM in 2013. Then in 2015, I had the opportunity to run the North American consulting team that was taking Watson into the world. And many hundreds of sessions with potential clients to identify opportunities for this new cognitive, they call it at the time, cognitive computing capability. And Watson, with all its limitations, was groundbreaking and was able to ingest large-scale documents and create interactive chatbots from it and do things like visual recognition and things like that. And so a lot of that work was really a mix between selling and evangelizing. And it was incredibly important to properly communicate to businesses what this thing is and isn't, what it's good at, how easy or difficult it would be to implement, and to identify suitable use cases. And so our team was at the forefront and talking to many companies, very large companies, smaller companies, and scouting for use cases and then making them come alive using a methodology where we built typically some kind of prototype. We created a user journey, a business case, and high-level architecture. And again, many of these things are the same today. It's critical for a business to identify opportunities for generative AI or traditional predictive AI that's based on structured data, to agree what makes something a good AI idea or not such a good AI idea, and to be able to have, as a team, unemotional conversations about who should go first. And with the great pressure that boards and senior leaders and also customers exert on businesses today, we have to do more AIs, is what I hear a lot, right? The board says we have to do more AI. Why don't we have a chatbot? And so a lot of those echoes from the past are quite familiar. And so if you look at what does it take to have a successful AI strategy or successful generative AI strategy as a subfield of that, it's incredibly important to decide on the right platform or the right set of platforms and making sure your data is ready. And most people get that, right? So the technology has to be solid. Governance is also equally important to prevent risky things, prevent reputational damage, prevent all kinds of operational risk. And then there's other things that you should also consider. For example, how do we build a solution portfolio as a team? How do we get agreement on what constitutes a good AI idea? How do we then prioritize them? What should we do first, second, third? How do we clearly identify what a partner should build versus ourselves or just buying commercial software? And how do we communicate about this inside and outside the organization? AI is not entirely a perfect brand. So many people have legitimate concerns, and the solid communication inside and outside of the organization about what is it we're doing, how do we go about it, how do we ensure it's ethical and explainable AI, and so on and so forth. And then last but certainly not least, talent. Do we have talent on board? What kind of talent do we have on board? How can we enable them to properly use this new technology? How do we develop new talent pipelines to the outside world? Because the vast majority of college grads or people who are proficient users of AI may not have the faintest idea that we exist as a company. And by the way, that we're also doing AI. So thinking holistically about AI strategy, that has absolutely not changed in 30 years. People are hyper-focused on the technology and the data. Some thinking goes into the governance, especially in regulated industries. But there's these three other incredibly important pillars. And having a holistic strategy that considers tech, governance, solution portfolio, people, and communication. And don't try to be perfect. Start pushing a little bit on each of those parts of the flywheel and it will start spinning. But quite often, folks simply have not even considered the importance of 3 out of 5 key elements of making something successful when it comes to AI, and frankly, any technology.
Sure. When you guys were with Watson, you worked with so many verticals and so many use cases, and not every use case really delivered the ROI. What were the prominent use cases back then, 10 years ago? And what are the prominent use cases now? Because you've seen both sides of the world.
Right.
Maybe you can just talk about that and how would they have evolved from very niche cases to something that you can apply anywhere, whatever you can imagine or you can apply. So that causes more confusion too. So I'm just trying to see how did the use cases evolve?
Yeah, I think the similarities are that cognitive friction was a sweet spot for Watson back then. Large document corpus, unlocking the value of static manuals or thousands of pages of procedures and policies or medical information. And those persist to this day as valuable use cases that people are struggling by and large with making sense of very large corpora and making decisions, translating code from one flavor to another. Also back then, an interesting use case. Image processing and video processing were even back then pioneered. We indexed all of the TED Talks, for example, using Watson. So you could semantically search and land on the right 2-minute snippet out of thousands of hours of video. That's, again, something that is now very prominent as a strong capability for generative AI. So summarization, translation broadly.
Sure.
Generating, natural language generation was less prevalent, I think. Was it a feature, but not as powerful as transformer-based models can be. We had a lot of, in a sense of translating between inside and outside the organization. One of the most prominent use cases that I was personally very involved with was H&R Block. And we had an incredibly short amount of time, only a few months, from kickoff to it had to go live in 10,000 locations with 70,000 advisors. So you can imagine that's a huge retail enablement push, installation push. Yeah. And ultimately, the form factor was we couldn't teach Watson the entire tax code. That was not possible. Still isn't really, not as glibly as it sounds. But we found out that to ensure adoption and uptake by the advisors themselves and satisfaction and ticking the box of what the thing had to accomplish for customers and to attract new customers into the H&R Block stores, we ultimately developed a solution that had two different views. So the advisor saw a different view than the customer. And it turns out that many of the advisors were not super comfortable. They were experts in numbers and they're really good at tax law and understanding how to get the best return and the most deductions for everybody. And quite a few of them did not really like the chit chat at the beginning. So we actually attached Watson to that. And the form it took is the conversation, it would show a prompt to the advisor of what they could say. Oh, tell me what you did last year. Did you move? And then if they moved or had a kid or moved into a new house, it then knew how to continue that conversation.
Okay.
And the advisor would literally type in their answer and Watson would turn it into a conversation. And what the customer saw at the same time was little bubbles popping up, mind map style. And let's say you had moved into your new home. Why did you move? Oh, I changed jobs. And then we would show you that because back then there were tax repercussions of that. Or I got married and I have children. So at the end of the intake, the customer would see a fairly complex mind map with bubbles and stalks and child and parent relationships between these things that were showing them their fairly complex tax picture. We had assisted the intake, the beginning and the exploration, the divergent part of the tax preparation. And then as the advisor would work through all of the tax repercussions, green check marks would appear on the customer side.
Nice.
So at the end, we had accomplished what one of the stated goals was. We should show that taxes are not linear and that we've given them peace of mind that they have gotten the most of their return. And so this was actually a huge success. Advisors loved it. Customers loved it. There was a Super Bowl ad with John Hamm that I excitedly pointed to the screen that, I did half of that, And it was also a good idea, a good representation of pragmatic AI, because it would have failed if we had tried to make Watson read and understand the entire tax book, even with the technology at the time that simply wouldn't have been possible. Yeah. But we used cognitive computing appropriately to the context, the overall project context, the amount of time we had, to go from intake in Kansas City in, I think it was July, to frozen, ready to install in December, which is not a huge amount of time. Then propagate it and enable all of the advisors that were going to use the system. So all in all, a very complex deployment. It was quite successful. It was appropriately sized and scaled for both the capability and the context. And yeah, I think everybody was very happy with the outcome. And then there were also in deployments that didn't work and some notable failures that then were dragged through the press. And that's part of the first mover disadvantage. If you're first, you're going to make mistakes and you're going to find a lot of things out in the market that's very unforgiving. And then the competition doesn't sleep. So it was a very dynamic field, clearly. But I would say the first 2 years of Watson were also a wild west of Watson and a lot of fun.
Yeah, these problems are still there, right? Even if you look at most of the firms, 70-80% of the AI projects fail. The same reasons. So I think it might be a good segue into actually talking about the framework that you have. We have a 4D framework. So our customers are in professional services. How do they apply? What is the framework? And then how do they apply your framework into driving AI adoption in the companies?
Sure. And one of the frameworks I mentioned is the 5 pillars of AI, which we already covered a little bit. There's more information on our website, which I'm sure we'll share in the show notes. The 4Ds are basically, they arose from a need at Wells Fargo, very large, obviously, organization at the time, I think close to 270,000 employees. And one of the needs that I detected early on in my tenure there was to communicate effectively with folks what makes something a good AI idea. And how could we enable the maximum number of people to quickly, in their own mind, triage ideas? Because everybody has, to this day, there's no shortage of ideas. Not all of them are good ones. And we wanted to create a more effective funnel that would push, as I call it, push the innovation left, push it into the subject matter experts so that they could come to the intake sessions with more qualified ideas that had a higher chance of being successful commercially and technically. And so one of the things we created was the 4D framework. And the 4Ds stand for data, dollars, differentiation, and deployability. And each one of those Ds, as you can imagine, has a lot more meat to it. So in the case of data, is the data for back then, traditional structured data machine learning, is the data labeled? Is it ready? Is it, from a regulatory point of view, available to this model? Can I even use it? Is it, sometimes there's geography limits, or is it too big? I can't move it out of its current repository. So the data gravity was considered. Do I have permission throughout the value chains to actually use it? And so on and so forth. Dollars is the dollar impact, and that's absolutely critical. I think any machine learning or AI model that cannot justify its impact on the top or bottom line should be very seriously looked at and maybe discarded, because at some point it doesn't matter. Even if it's a risk reduction model, there are ways to quantify risk reduction. But to see if there's a top line driver that will increase our share of wallet or share of market and things like that. Is there a bottom line OpEx takeout that I can shorten call center calls or make things onboarding a new customers much more efficient and faster and cheaper? And importantly, do I have a budget owner who can actually stand up for that value? So if I promise $5 million in savings, is there an actual human person that can sign up for that and has the budget authority and the scale to make that saving a reality? Because unless it's green dollars, it doesn't really much matter. Then the differentiation, don't say yes to everything. Not everything's an AI problem. Not everything's a Gen AI problem. Sometimes robotics process automation is superior. Sometimes it's not a technical problem at all. We've had instances where we would diagnose in Watson and other places, we diagnose the issue, observe, frame it properly, try to find what the actual driving imperatives are. And then at the end of the day, it was an organization change management problem. I distinctly remember one case where both the customer and our team wanted the answer to be Watson. And after 6 weeks, we said basically, semi-jokingly, the answer is beer. And that caused some consternation. And I said, these two teams are not talking to each other. It's not a master data management problem. We could patch it. We could put a Band-Aid on it. But in reality, in addition to co-locating the teams, they should go on an offsite and just get to know each other. And then that would much more effectively address the problem than any kind of technical solution. And then deployability, absolutely essential. Is the data available? Can I pipe it into the solution? And then what catches the output? What system will consume the machine learning or Gen AI output? And if there's no catching system, then wait or don't do it. We had an example of a very promising model, double-digit million-dollar savings, but the catching system that was actually going to action the output was simply not going to be ready for 18 months because it was on its own life cycle, on its own schedule. So this one went on ice because we simply weren't able to do it. So within the 4Ds, we then created enablement assets from a very tiny few minutes of infographic explainer video to a 1 hour or so podcast / live recording to an article you could read in about 15 minutes. We designed it all to be self-enablement ready so that people could just download it. And if they had a question about, if they would ping the team with the question, I have an idea, can you help me understand if it's a good one? We said, sure, but you have to consume one of these 3 things first. And everybody has 3 minutes, so there's no excuse. And the quality and velocity of the ideas really dramatically improved. And because we forced people early on to then also create a simple plain English value story, answering whose life is going to get better, by how much, how do you know that? By using the 4Ds. That then created a consistency in execution, because now the engineering team and the IT team and the risk team and the owner, the business owner themselves, as well as second line risk and audit, they would all understand in plain English, coming back to the communication pillar, what's this thing about, right? And not using $5 technical words about gradient descent and lemmatization, but saying, here in plain terms is what it's going to do, how I know it's going to, or how I think it's going to provide value, how I know that because I can instrument it. And by the way, here's the budget owner who said, yes, that's true. And so it comes back to whether you use gradient boosting or neural nets or generative AI, the technology is 5 or 10%, 95% everything else. Communication.
Change management,
exactly.
It's one of those it's actually one of the key components, like people who have done business transformation. You've done so many of them. I've done a few of them in my life, and a lot of people get hung up on technology. Right. This is this new shiny object and it's going to change the way we do business. But change management is the hardest part, and there is a whole bunch of things that go around it. And if people don't think and conceive the right transformation in a holistic way, like the framework you're mentioning, like a lot of them will end up being investments that go nowhere, right? You try something, it partially works, maybe you have a little impact here and there, but fundamentally you're wasting money across the organization. And especially with the stakes that are so high now, if you're not doing it right in the right type of transformation, that means you're going to be behind and you might lose the game. You might be out of business. So the stakes are a lot higher than some of the earlier transformations. Digital transformation was big. The stakes were high back then. But now with this AI transformation, at least a lot more companies are feeling that the stakes are extremely high, right?
The execution pressure is just crazy right now, right? Because as I mentioned, the board, the street, everybody says, we have to do more AI. What are we doing with AI and generative AI especially? And it's easy to get started because unlike Watson, the barrier of entry of creating a chatbot that's powered by thousands of pages of documents is pretty easy. Now you just, even if you just use like a naive RAG pipeline, this retrieval augmented generation, it's pretty easy to make something, even as a layperson, that's 80% good enough. It won't scale, and the other 20% become near impossible if you don't set it up correctly, small things. But to get to a demo or an MVP, it's very trivial today.
In a matter of hours,
There are many things you should consider in addition to just dragging PDF files into a vector database. But it's very easy to make something that seems to work, and then you neglect. So it's easy to get started and hard to undo. And if you develop kind of this whole ecosystem of shadow AI where everybody's rolling their own and have their preferred tool, and you don't agree on the chunking strategy and the metadata and many other things that make this stuff work across the organization, that it becomes extremely hard to undo because people don't want to let go of their point solution. And shadow AI is very prevalent, right? So especially in organizations that for regulatory and governance reasons said, no, we have to turn this off or restrict it heavily. people bring their ChatGPT on their phone to work, and it still works, and you can talk to it, and you'll see a huge amount of sudden inbound email traffic. That's people emailing the results to themselves in a non-really trackable way. So that's I think one of the tensions right now is, and that's true in large organizations and small organizations, that is leadership aligned? Are they setting an example themselves, and because of a better intuitive understanding? And maybe one of the things I started doing about 6 months ago is teach these seminars to C-suites. It's an afternoon, and I call them beacon AI because it's the opposite of shadow AIs, because they act like a beacon. They set their example. And it's hands-on. It's a half an hour of just foundations and what's the difference between AI and machine learning, and what are vectors and what are tokens, and how do LLMs actually work. And then we build stuff together. And one of the rules is that everybody has to bring a device.
Yeah.
And we do hands-on creation of a custom GPT or an artifact in Claude or a custom project and or gem and a notebook. And every time I've taught this, and it's very small organizations that are small and medium-sized businesses here in Pennsylvania and York or in Pittsburgh, and very large organizations like an $8 billion lender in New York or Rock Skincare. They wrote about it on LinkedIn. Invariably, it's the same result, is when you empower people to do it themselves, they have a much better intuitive understanding of what is and isn't, how quickly they can make progress themselves on their own device, on an iPad, on their laptop. And then how it teaches them more than 1 million slides. What an actual lived AI strategy actually is, and how to progress by experimenting and safely. Because if it's a bank, you obviously have to be very careful and have the right governance around it. But this is a big unlock for the leaders who often feel, they won't say it, but they feel left behind. They feel overwhelmed. They don't really know some of the lingo. And so taking that kind of fear, uncertainty, and doubt out of the system, channeling it into action bias based on real lived experience, makes a big difference at the top, right? And then, again, it's not trivial to then roll that out to a large organization. But I
at
found
least they
that
know what questions to ask. They know the complexity that it involves. Interesting you said that. So earlier this year, we were leaning in on AI across the board, but like we didn't go through your training. But one of the first things we did was I said, hey, let's have a learning session. So I said, I'm going to teach the rest of the company. So I self-taught myself a whole bunch of things. And every week I would go and say, hey, here is what I learned. And then I would show what I built. I would translate into, hey, first week we did basics, and second week we did custom GPTs. Third week we did some basic agents and skills. Fourth week we did something else. The idea was exactly the same thing. I had to learn for myself and bring the whole thing. We're a small company, so I had to bring it to the rest of the company. But I think along the way, since I was learning and I was teaching, then it's not that hard. So like the rest of the company, they were doing it, and they started building a whole bunch of cloud skills, and then we were sharing across team members, and some functions automated a whole bunch of things just by building it themselves. But we're still very small when compared to, let's say, a 10,000 people company. Obviously, they can't do it this way. But the key is, because I spend the time to learn what it takes, I can ask the right questions to figure out what is the best opportunity that I see within the functions. I have some intuition on it. And then what does it take for us to drive adoption of this new technology that really creates a meaningful business impact in each of the functions? So I think that confidence and intuition really got us so many positive things across organizations. So what you're enabling is definitely that, but for much larger organizations, to bring not necessarily the tech inquisitive leaders into that and getting immersed into those sessions. And because they go back with a profound understanding of not what it is, but what is possible and what are the right questions to ask to drive adoption.
And it raises, one of the key differentiators is, do you have a static mindset or an experimentation mindset? And with the stuff, it's very easy to experiment. And if you give just broadly the minimum viable education around governance, depending on your industry, if you're a regulated industry versus a marketing agency, let's say, and understanding what are absolute no-nos, like never upload PII or PHI into a public chatbot and things like that. Similar to, if you wouldn't cut and paste it into Google, then probably shouldn't put it into a chatbot either. And enabling people to have the confidence to experiment. That's what it is. And that's what you described, right? And it's also, this stuff is moving so quickly that it's absolutely foolish to try to design like this magnificent 6-month course. By the time you're done making it, it will have completely changed.
That's right.
Today, major feature drops. Today, Opus 4.7 came out. A brand new scheduling capability in Claude Code came out. And the cadence of new events is just staggering, and it's almost impossible to keep up.
Yeah.
The only way you can keep up is you keep continuously playing with it and going, oh, what's this? Click on that. What's this new option now? What does this now? Keep reading newsletters and actually self-experimenting. And I think the big paradigm shift is that both through actual technology, through facts and attitude, programming and AI used to have a pretty forbidding aura. It's just like, oh, only very few people understand this. Or you have to wear a white lab coat to understand how gradient descent works, or data science, the scary words. And now the programming language is English. Just tell it what you want to do. And there's some skill in knowing how to tell it. But the how level of skill is being automated away. That's both positive and negative. And it causes pretty big challenges currently in entry-level jobs, because simple how tasks that used to be done by, let's say, first, second year, or recent entrants or recent grads, those things are being eaten away very actively by AI. The what to do, that's still fairly differentiated. And while machines are incredibly amazing at building things, if you tell it to build the wrong thing, it's still going to be garbage, right?
Yeah.
And I've seen demos of like wafer scale chips that can create a clone of Salesforce in seconds.
Yeah.
But what to do is still driven by human intuition, orthogonal thinking, creative thinking, and things like that, understanding them, having a sense for the market, and other skills that are not baked into the LLM per se. And then even more importantly, why are we doing things? That's even more rarefied. And I think that LLMs and agentic systems broadly are still quite far away from that today, but they're evolving very quickly. So focusing on not trying to, like, how do you write a style sheet? The machine knows that, is much faster at that. How do you write well-architected modular Python code or C code? You're really getting there with Codex and the latest and 4.7, and these things are just pretty amazing at that.
Yeah.
What is it building? You have to tell it. Otherwise, it's just a blinking cursor, right?
That's right.
The enablement that you mentioned and that I also mentioned is getting them to the confidence to make what decisions and why decisions.
Yeah.
Because they now have a little bit more understanding, almost you could call it machine empathy, right? They understand how these things think, what they're good at, not good at. And it's almost like being empathetic with this intern savant machine that can, if you set it off, it just runs like crazy, but you have to set it off in the right direction. And understanding that a little bit more deeply is a key unlock for organizations.
Absolutely. Yeah. Rightfully said. I think there is so much power to harness, but it is onus is on you to harness the power by just giving the context and making it really understand the context and a lot about what you need to achieve, and then it can do the work. Going into a double click on some of the things you mentioned in your blogs, let's talk about AI adoption generally. Like, there is a lot of news recently, a lot of money is going into this, adopting AI, but 70-80% of the money in projects are failing, different variations of it. There is exuberance. Everybody starts, but most of them will fail, and that the failure rate has been increasing dramatically in the last few months, especially from January to March. The failure rate has increased more as per some of the news sources. You have done this for so many years now. You've seen all variations of failures and all variations of success. What are the 3 or 4 things that are key determinants of success? And what are 1 or 2 things that are like, if you don't do it right, you're guaranteed to fail? If you can unpack that.
In addition to the holistic approach that I mentioned before, to have a really comprehensive view that's not just about the tech, I think it's a commercial focus and a pragmatic focus. I call it no BS AI. Do you have that in your company, or are you like a fast and confused follower of trends. And we've seen that with almost any technology. I remember clearly when websites became a thing in the mid-90s. We have to have a website, and then, of course, you'd build a website that looked just like a scanned-in brochure, and then people realized that this is not it. It's like the first TV commercials were people reading text like in the radio, because they basically had a radio commercial on the TV. And just like websites that were static images and like a kind of an electronic version of the brochure missed entirely what this technology was able to do. And then iPads came out much later, 2009, I think the first iPads came out or thereabouts. iPhone was 2007. And suddenly iPads came out. And almost everybody we talked to back then said, we have to have an iPad app. And my answer was always, why? What's that going to do? Just because it's on the iPad in a big format. And with AI, similarly, ask why. Ask why questions. Ask simple questions, like not so simple to answer, but simple to ask. Whose life will actually get better because of this? And by how much? And how do you know that? How do you instrument that? How can you calculate the benefit and impact holistically from a user-centric design experience point of view, from a full life cycle innovation point of view? So asking, these are all very old. Design thinking is a very old concept. It completely applies to AI as well. And not be blinded by just because it's easy and fast now, that have you framed the problem correctly? Even that is a huge topic, and often people go quickly, they observe a problem and then build a solution. And that's missing two really important steps, which is the framing of the problem. Am I seeing it contextually correctly? And if I frame it right, then what are the imperatives of doing something? And then you can solution, right? And so these are best practices of designing anything, like a shopping cart or an AI solution or a plate. But because it's so easy to get started now, and you can just tell it what you want to do, and magically stuff appears on the screen, it's so tempting to skip the two steps in between, to go from observation to converging on a solution instead of diverging first and saying, let's take a step back. Am I really understanding this correctly? And one of my favorite examples is if you remember many years ago, the iPod came out, now retired. And the first iPods, I think, were 2004 or thereabouts. And the packaging was just genius. It was just a very simple box, and there was a silhouette, and all you would see were the white headsets. That was it. That was the package. Genius, absolute marketing genius. And if you compare it to the Zune, which followed shortly thereafter in Microsoft land, the box was a classic Microsoft with fold-out panels, and there's a hilarious YouTube video on that. If Microsoft had designed the iPod package, look it up. It's just really funny. And it was, all the specs were on there. And what did the iPod package really tell about the device? And why were the headsets white? Because they did proper framing. And the framing included not only the headset, of course, has to work and take the sound to the ear, but if you were to design a practical headset, you would make it black, like all the other black headsets out there at the time, because it's a much more practical color, and white gets mangy really quickly. But they understood that the framing was, hey, I'm an Apple customer. I'm a forward thinker. I'm a modern person. I'm maybe even more desirable to date, if you want to take it that far. I'm a hip early adopter of this cool new technology, but this device is really this tiny, and it's in my pocket all the time. So how do I communicate all of the things about me being a hip Apple customer when the device is invisible? You can do that with a white headset. And that is the distinction. That's proper framing. And AI problems or AI solutions are just like that. And you have to think about not just features, functions, speeds, and feeds, but also what's the context in which this stuff lives. It could be a product, a service, doesn't much matter. But the folks that succeed at this and that deliver commercial value and get repeat customers have usually done a much better job at framing holistically, having a commercial focus, so not falling for the trap of we will do it just because we can. We've thought about the impact on the bottom line, the top line. We have a way to measure it. And then lastly, very importantly, one great way to have a fast start and a brutal finish 6 months later, where you get defunded, is to not talk about it.
Yes.
And sometimes it's difficult because it's product development life cycles, even in Gen AI land, are often more than a few weeks. It may take you months to go from concept to running prototype. What are you in between? What do you do I think the maximum you can go without without communicating to your upline or your funders in an efficient and effective way is about 8 weeks. If you don't talk about it often enough in a language that can be understood and that it can land, you're very likely to get defunded. And I've seen it many times. And if you talk about the wrong way, you might also get uninstalled from the organization. And so
That's right.
Thinking about the communication, how do you set up the AI thing is the product. Without distribution, products are useless and they will never return a benefit and they will not be good for your career and so on. So how do you set up your communication distribution cadence right from the start? What are you going to talk about in 8 weeks? Maybe you have not even written a line of code yet. That's okay. You can do other things. You can do an infographic video or a chart, or you have a town hall where you talk about it in plain English that is accessible to other people. So those are the things that can end careers if you do it wrong. If you jump the gun and you talk about the benefits without clearing them with the business owner, for example, very dangerous. Or if you don't just go silent running mode and then people lose interest and something else that's more shiny comes along and suddenly needs the funding. So this success is hugely multifactorial, and it is usually a set of overlapping measures that address all of the things that make any product successful. And it's just as important with AI as it is, as I said, shopping carts or
anything else.
cars.
Yeah. One of the narratives now we have is, I think, two things. One is most companies are trying to mandate that they have to do something in AI. It's like everybody has to use ChatGPT. If you don't use ChatGPT, you'll get punished. And you have to use it these many tokens, these many hours, whatever that thing, vanity metric might be. I think there is that going on. So instead of talking about why it is important, what benefit it is for you, and trying to talk about the transformation needed and the focus on the why and the what, they're jumping into the how and just putting metrics and without buy-in, they're making everybody do the work. So there is that side of the story. And the other side of the story is a lot of people are trying to roll out, and you see the backlash of the negative effects. So it could be the chatbot is misbehaving, or it could be some AI is misbehaving and it is causing some issues, and there are some lawsuits that are filed, hallucinations happening, and it has a business implication and stuff like that. So you see both sides where it's not conceived right and communicated right, and the leadership is not doing the right governance on one side. On the other side, when you do all of that, your deployment is screwed up and it has done bad effects, which they couldn't control, and then you fail it. So I think your framework kind of addresses all of those in a very structured way. So which is awesome. You mentioned a lot about trust but verify. I want you to double click on it. This is something we used to talk about it in our previous jobs. Like this frame of trust and verify existed for a while in different business problem settings. Like pricing would be a classic one. You would say, hey, look, we don't check how many user licenses people are using. We just think you're in the right band. But once in a while, we'll just make sure we verify and we do a spot check if you fall into that band or not. If there is an overage, then we charge you. Otherwise, we trust you, right? So we had these concepts in multiple places, but especially in AI where data is everything, and that is the foundation. So can you double click on how that trust and verify manifests in the world of AI?
Yeah, and coming back a little bit to the measures and metrics that you mentioned. After the pandemic, there was a return to work, and it was very unpopular. And so then people would mandate you have to be in the office at least twice a week, 5 days a week. And at first, people would the metric became the badge swipe, but almost always the badge swipe in.
Yeah.
And so people started coffee badging. So it was just go into the office, have a coffee, and leave.
Yeah.
And it was a good example of Goodhart's law. There's an interesting law called Goodhart's law, and it says that any metric that becomes a target ceases to be a good metric. By and large, that's true. So if you are incenting a factory to make as many nails as possible, they'll make impossibly small nails. Or if you incent a machine learning system to maximize fee revenue, it starts splitting up families in the airplane. And so those are all examples of Goodhart's law at work, and you can probably think of many of them in your own world. So if you say you must consume X tokens, that's, I think, an example of Goodhart's law, which is not, why are you measuring that? What if I sit there still for an hour and make the perfect prompt and consume a very small amount of tokens, but I've done 3 hours of work?
Yeah.
So that's just measuring like how fast can you crank the machine seems nonsensical to me. Mandating things that you must use AI, otherwise you get punished. Contextually, that may be the right answer, but I think that it's questionable. Why do you have to force people? And it is also true that it's not that not commercial organizations are not democracies. So if you are in a job where this will legitimately make you a lot faster, just like you're not allowed to use Notepad or VI to write HTML code today, because that would be like super slow and not in the best interest of the shareholders and the company and yourself. If you're writing style sheets or modifying style sheets or writing code and translating COBOL into a more modern language, yeah, absolutely, you should use the most modern tools, just like you would use an integrated development environment, because you're not allowed to hand weave code in DOS, right?
Yeah.
If there will be people that don't want to do that, and that's also okay, and then maybe they're not in the right place. And that's been true for every technology ever introduced. When personal computers came out and the typing tools disappeared from offices that used to be prevalent, if you watch Mad Men, there were huge rooms full of people that do nothing but type because the executives would only dictate. They would never type.
That's right.
And if you're an executive today and you don't want to type, then probably there's going to be some difficulty with that, right? Because dictation machines where you purely dictate and never touch a keyboard, those jobs have also disappeared. And so it's similarly with AI, that will also be true. But I think, yes, value communication, showing people how this is not necessarily threatening your job, but parts of your job that you may not really like very much. And how do we make AI do the repetitive work that can be encoded, that is not very human, not challenging human imagination. But it's also very true that this is more disruptive, I think, than many other previous technologies, quite frankly. It's automating cognitive work, and it's doing a pretty damn good job at a lot of it that used to be done by entry-level, mid-level professionals and some very senior professionals. So this will be extremely disruptive. And it's not to say that we blithely can just say, no, like a couple of years ago, AI won't take your job. It's a person using AI. And that's also not actually true. AI has already taken some jobs. And it's very obvious in some of the labor statistics. So that's a serious societal problem, should be top of mind for political leaders, business leaders. I think more disruptive and much faster moving than previous technology transformations. The dot-com revolution took about 10 years to go from the mid-90s, when websites were still novelty, not every company had a website, to, let's say, 2004, when Google incorporates and Google now, right? And then the iPhone comes out and apps revolutionize everything yet again. But if you were a travel agent in 1995, and there were travel agencies everywhere, at every corner almost, and then Travelocity comes out and Expedia, and then the apps and Kayak and things like that. And by 2004, travel agencies had shrunk by probably 80-90%. And the ones that remained had some specialty offering on top of booking tickets. They had some more better advisory or other more human things. So it's incredibly transformative. And I struggle to keep up, and it's my job to keep up with this. And I read 3 newsletters every day, and I experiment with the latest thing that Claude came out with today. I'm already using it. But not everybody has that luxury, because people have day jobs and have to do other things. So I think to succeed, if you were to distill it, like what are some of the key factors that will make you successful in the AI economy, is absolutely have an experimentation mindset. Try it. First rule, just try it, see what happens within the bounds of sanity. You can't still take client data and just try something, because you have governance restrictions, and try to make synthetic data if you want to experiment, or find ways to safely experiment within the strictures of your business. And just let the machine do what it's best at. So prompt engineering was supposed to be this big job. Now I chuckle when I hear that somebody wants to go into prompt engineering, because that's not really a thing anymore. The machine does a much better job at that than you can.
In 6 months, that job got created and eliminated.
It's eliminated. It has a very short tenure. It was like a tiny little blip. And what's still true, though, is if I wanted to make a system prompt for a custom GPT, with all the roles and the output formats and the limitations and the strictures and things like that, and the no-nos, I can prompt the thing to make its own prompt. And that will, by and large, in Markdown format, be much, much better than what I can write. That I need to know what to do is still true a human skill. That's still, so I think prompt engineering has evolved to knowing what to prompt, right?
That's right.
And how to prompt the machine to write something really good, but not to actually write the prompt, because the flavors of Claude and GPT and Gemini, they all like slightly different accents, but they know themselves really well. They know how to write these prompts. Experiment, yes, safely within the right governance. Have the minimum viable education to know what you can do safely and how. Just do it. Then let the machine do what the machine does best. And that's, I call it, be aggressively lazy. So figure out if the machine would be much better at this than you are, and then how do you get the machine to produce good output stochastically and within the bounds of your risk tolerance. And then keep learning. It's every day. The cadence of change can be overwhelming, but you, just like they say, control the surfboard, not the wave. The wave is the way how the stuff changes, like in a crazy fashion. And the surfboard is what you can control. Is it which newsletters you consume? Do you try to set aside 5 minutes to experiment with a new feature? Do you try out a new pattern?
Yeah.
And like that. And lastly, this is really important.
Yeah.
Don't use it for anything where you cannot judge the quality of the output. So don't use it for high-risk transactions or tasks when you cannot judge the quality of the output. If you use it for legal and you're not a lawyer, that's fine. You may shortcut. You may take a lot of the uncertainty and ambiguity out of the process, because Claude Legal is pretty damn good. But if this is an important transaction, please give it to a lawyer afterwards. Invariably, we'll find things that you should not give to the client, right? That should not give to your partner. So, yes, experiment safely. Yes, just try it. Yes, absolutely. If you cannot judge the quality, and it matters, quality matters, is measurable. So it's not like a Shakespearean sonnet about kittens where there is no quality criterion, but it's something like a contract where you could even inadvertently put a poison pill in or a really bad clause. Then give it to somebody who's skilled in the art and is qualified to judge the quality of the output. And if that's you, that's wonderful. Use it wildly and at will. If it's not you, please find somebody, a human, to review it. That goes back to your question about, is the human always in the loop? It depends on the risk of the output greatly, right? And if you can judge it, or if something bad happens, if a bad action is taken, agentically or otherwise, if the AI output just goes into the wild.
That's right. I'm looking at time, so I have two more questions, and we can wrap up. So can you double click on the governance? You mentioned governance a few times. What is governance, AI governance means, and how do you start, and what is it supposed to do?
The governance is basically the rules and regulations, processes, procedures, policies, and controls that will let you do AI safely, or anything safely, right? There's governance for driving and cutting hair. You have to be licensed and using AI. And governance depends a lot on your context. So if you're a bank or healthcare provider, your governance, as it should be, is much, much stricter about using AI or machine learning than it would be for somebody who is deciding which shoe ad to place next on the carousel. And because the consequences are potentially catastrophic for your health or finances, or less click-through, which is not as bad. It's not great, but it's not terrible. So governance in regulated industries is very evolved when it comes to AI classic, aka machine learning, predictive, deterministic AI, structured data AI. Very comprehensive rules and regulations, best practices, well-established separation of duties. There's a first line, second line, third line often. There's a well-developed model validation and development processes and policies and procedures and controls. Not that much exists for generative AI, also because inherently it's a totally different technology. It behaves very differently. A traditional, let's say, fraud scoring model will always give you a fraud score, always give you a credit score, and it will never do anything else. And it's also robust and can be tested end to end, and the training data and things like that. None of these things are true for a frontier model, like a Claude 4.7. There's a lot of stuff in there. It's basically the entire internet plus plus. It has an infinite number of use cases. You can never fully test it. You can test it on a use case. You can create rates that become almost deterministic. But because of its hosting architecture, especially if you're calling it via an API, There will always be some randomness in there, and you can control for that. But the way you test these models is wildly different from a fraud model. And its governance is wildly different. And all of the artifacts of governance, the validation scripts and so on, and the cadence, how often do you revalidate, all of that is totally different and emerging. Let's call it emerging. There are now some very good frameworks for doing this from NIST and IST. And they had an outstanding framework, the risk management framework for AI models before generative AI, which has now since been appended with a corpus called 601, so the number 600-1, that is now reaching into the generative AI land and creating some very good standards, how to measure yourself by voluntary adherence and aspirational almost for all organizations, and not quite as deterministic and strict as, let's say, credit underwriting, which is much more regulated for good reasons, right? But so governance is, there's regulatory bodies, there are laws, there are, for example, local laws. New York has a local law 144 that says if you use any kind of automated tools in making employment decisions, you must have a third-party audit checking your tool to make sure it's not introducing any bias, which makes a ton of sense. If you have an AI black box and it takes people's last names and says no good, then that would be terrible and not appropriate. So there are local, regional laws, state laws, federal laws, international laws, European laws, and so on that combine with then other voluntary, semi-voluntary best practices and things like that to be governance. And generative AI is moving so fast. Agentic AI, now there's agentic AI governance, which is judging the quality of a tool chain output. That did not exist a year ago, really. So it's a very fast-moving field. Very few people have true expertise and can give you good advice on this. And if you're in a regulated industry, you better think about that, because you don't want bad either reputational or fiscal outcomes based on poor governance of these systems.
Yeah. The last question, I think you mentioned your framework a few times. Maybe you could just summarize your 5-part of the framework, because that is very powerful and useful for to all the listeners.
Sure. Yeah. So I call it the 5 pillars of AI, and it's the platform, including data, and thinking about data also as liquid data assets versus big globs of data or puddles of data sitting in a warehouse without good use. Data liquidity is a big topic. You can look up MIT writing on that. It's very good stuff. Then there is the governance, which we just went through. Like, how do you think about the strictures in which you can safely do AI and ethically? There's communication. How do you talk inside and outside of the organization about AI? And how do you create common vision for projects and the overall AI effort? How do you attract and retain and retrain internally, cross-skill, upskill your own talent that's already on board? And then lastly is the solution portfolio. So how do you create a comprehensive, meaningful portfolio that has clear priorities, also is very clear on who does what? Should we do it? Should our partners do it? Where can we experiment quickly and safely because we already have the skill and we know that the customers want it? Where do we place disruptive bets where we don't know if the customers inside and outside the organization want it, but we're not sure we can do it, but if it succeeds, it's going to be a game changer. And so all 5 things together make a holistic AI strategy. And if you're interested in a deeper dive, a mind map that lays all of this out is on my website. It's free. You can just download it. And then the mind map has about 60 plus bubbles that are in the main overview. And you can think of them, each of them as a chapter or multiple chapters in a book, that there is much more complexity underneath that, as you can imagine. But that together, if you're really considering all of these drivers and forces, you won't be able to do everything perfectly, and you shouldn't wait for perfection because you'll never get started. But it's good to push gently on all of the 5 pillars to make sure that there's a little energy, nothing pushes the other way, right? So if you're neglecting one of them, then it's like spinning a flywheel, and one of the or 2 of the people that are supposed to spin it are pushing the other way. And of course, that's going to be heartache and grief.
Yeah.
So that's one of the frameworks I like to use. You can apply that to really any technology. AI is specifically suited for this because there's so much volatility in the sector and so much uncertainty in the users, because almost everybody feels overwhelmed and left behind. So even more important to have a little bit more of a structured framework. And then for individual use cases, I use the 4 Ds. Those apply equally well to structured and unstructured data and generative AI and traditional AI. And so those two frameworks work together quite well.
Awesome. Bjorn, really appreciate you taking time. Thanks again.
All right. Thank you.